The war between Russia and Ukraine grinds into close to now 2.5 years. The United States is on the cusp right now of signing and so is NATO, a long-term agreement with Ukraine. Now that's a little curious given the circumstances here, but literally within hours from now, Biden and Zelensky will have a press conference where they're going to announce some of the details of this security agreement. And so we don't have all the details yet. That'll be coming up later this afternoon. But we do have a pretty good outline of what the intent is. But we're going to talk today about why that doesn't really make a lot of sense and try to see if we can unpack exactly what is going on. And we have nobody better to do that than Colonel Jacques Baud, former Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, former NATO official, and just brilliant guy all the way around. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back in your show. Thanks.
Truly, you're one of the best analytical minds that is out there anywhere, on whether it's mainstream media or internet shows like this, because you just tell the truth. You just say, here's what my analysis says, and you don't skew it one way or the other or just try to put it on weird language to hide your meanings, and we really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, let's just get into it here. So first of all, the idea of at this point, at the nearly the 2.5 year mark, now signing some sort of a 10-year agreement, which has been said variously by like Stoltenberg, and certainly the United States is about to apparently quantify that here, just seems a little bit odd. But here's some of the things that Zelensky himself, he's actually been wanting this for quite a long time. Here's what he said, I think a couple months back.
Our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years.
For the next 10 years. Now, when he said that in April, we may have even played that clip for you a couple of months back, shortly after he said it, but we just thought it was kind of odd to be looking 10 years down the road when I'm not sure 10 months down the road this war's even going to be going on. When you hear him say that, on the one hand, it's like, all right, well, I could get why he would want that, but then it's a separate issue for what is actually possible. When you hear him say stuff like this, what goes through your mind?
Well, I think in fact, it's a logical consequence of what we have noticed in the last 2 years. Remember that in 2008, NATO accepted the idea of having Georgia and Ukraine as candidate members to the alliance. But the fact of the matter is that they couldn't integrate or accept those two countries into NATO because of the tensions with Russia. And remember that these tensions were exactly the problem that Alexei Arestovich, I think I showed you the video a few weeks ago, that was the problem that even the Ukrainians themselves have noticed, that with these tensions, as long as Russia exists, there is no possibility for Ukraine to enter NATO, because then that would mean the possible activation of Article 5, or what's, in other words, NATO solidarity, in order to cope with the problem. So the entering NATO was basically excluded. So the solution was, in fact, to create another type of security relationship. And remember what Chancellor Scholz said a few days ago, that was reported in the New Voice of Ukraine, that there is no chance for Ukraine to enter NATO in the next 30 years. And the reason for that is, of course, that you have what in fact Stoltenberg used to say. I mean, he said in April last year that NATO is a nuclear alliance, meaning that when you have a possible tension with one of the members, the risk of entering a nuclear crisis is big, is very big. As a result, they had to find an alternative solution to NATO. And that's why they started a few months ago to have those bilateral security agreement. It was first signed with several countries, including France. And basically, that's the reason why France came up with this idea of sending troops in Ukraine, because it was under the umbrella of this security agreement, which is purely bilateral, meaning that if you have a confrontation, let's say with French troops with Russian troops, that wouldn't involve the NATO solidarity. I mean, NATO or US or whoever in NATO is not obliged to intervene because obviously there is no Article 5. So that's in fact what we are witnessing, and probably it's also interesting to see which countries have made such agreements with Ukraine at this stage. And you will see that basically most of NATO countries, I mean, mostly interesting. It's interesting to see that most the Western NATO countries, not the Eastern ones, but interestingly enough,
Right.
have made those bilateral agreements, which are, as the name says, they're bilateral, meaning that they may not be all the same. And the content of these agreements, I mean, the operational side of these agreements are confidential, meaning that there's a lot of things we don't know about these agreements. We don't know exactly what they cover. We know that they cover provision for equipment, for instance, ammunition, and that sort of thing, including political support and logistical support, financial support, and this kind of thing. As to troops and the extent of the provision of troops, this is not known because of the confidentiality of these agreements. But basically what we are witnessing here is the creation of a kind of an alternative NATO, so to say. And that's interesting because it shows that NATO, as it was designed in 1949, is no longer suited for the kind of situation we have now. So we have something
now
which
correct me
is...
if I'm wrong, though, that in that screen you were showing a second ago, that all the bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, none of those have any kind of even a version of an Article 5, right? It's just more like support, not that we're going to fight for you.
Well, that's one thing. But in addition to that, there is no, since they are bilateral, they commit only those who have signed, meaning that if you have a commitment, let's say, of German troops, although the Germany doesn't want to send troops, but let's take, let's say, France, because they are willing to send troops. If you have troops in Ukraine, that commit only France. If anything happened to these troops, that will not commit any other country. This is totally bilateral. The same applies to the equipment that is provided to Ukraine. If Germany provides any equipment to Ukraine, it doesn't imply any commitment from France. So we have a multi-bilateral type of agreement. So it's not a multilateral as it is in NATO. NATO is a group of countries who have agreed to defend collectively and to assist each other in case of problem. Here in that situation, the situation we have now, it's a multi-bilateral, meaning that only individual countries are committed and not collectively, meaning that we don't have any equivalent of the Article 5 in these agreements. But that's the best they can get at this stage, because nobody wants, and especially the US, by the way. That's the reason why very quickly, as soon as the French came up in February and later in early May this year, when Macron came with this idea of sending troops to Ukraine, the US said very quickly, this is just a bilateral thing between France and Ukraine. We will not send troops. And the reason why they don't want, it's not because they don't want to send troops, because I'm sure that the Blinken and Nuland clique, they certainly would like to send troops to Ukraine, but they can't because of the commitment it implies if it's done in the framework of NATO. And that's the reason why very quickly the US excluded the commitment of US troops. I mean, when I'm talking about troops, I'm talking about organized units.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about individual soldiers
Individuals, yeah.
or trainers or experts and that kind of thing, which, by the way, are already in Ukraine, or even special forces, but probably special forces in an advising role and probably not in a direct involvement role, probably. But
now, here's, you just talked about all these number of bilateral. I think that Blinken has previously given us maybe a clue as to what the U.S. version of this may be later this afternoon when he said this.
I'm convinced that Ukraine can effectively hold the line in the east. It can continue to press the advantages achieved for itself in the Black Sea, where it's getting as much out through the Black Sea, feeding the world, as it did before the Russian reinvasion of Ukraine, as well as to hold Russian forces at risk, including in Crimea, to make it more difficult for them to continue this aggression. We've been providing the systems to do that. But it's a challenging moment. We are not going anywhere, and neither are more than some 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine. That will continue, and if Putin thinks he can outlast Ukraine, outlast its supporters, he's wrong.
Yeah, but is he wrong? There was a couple of things that he said in there which really stood out, because I know it's things that you've talked about before and always want to highlight, is that he said systems. We provided systems. But when you have all these different entities with bilateral relationships and agreements, that means it's unique to those two countries and not necessarily a system as it is in NATO, like a NATO system here. So two things. One, if you could talk about the complications of the absence of an actual system. And then number two, can Putin, can the West actually make it so that the Putin can't outlast them? Because as we've seen in just recent days, the European parliaments are starting to shift in a different direction where they're not so excited about continuing on with this. So is a 10-year process even possible? So those two things first.
Well, I think you're right to bring forward this question of systemic approach to the war. In fact, and as Blinken said, in fact, we just expect Ukraine to hold the line, period. We are not expecting Ukraine to win. We are not expecting Ukraine to recover the sovereignty over the borders it had in early 2022. We just expect Ukraine to hold the line. Basically, it's just to keep an open tension with Russia. And that's exactly what we have said already many times on this channel, that the purpose of the whole thing is to weaken Russia and to try to destabilize Russia rather than to have an operational success for Ukraine. And if we see, for instance, when we talk about a system, and we can, of course, talk about the systemic approach of an army, which is in itself a system, but we can also talk about the weapon systems. And we are talking now about providing F-16 to Ukraine. And at the same time, you have, very strangely enough, you have the Emmanuel Macron coming up with providing Mirage 2000 to Ukraine. And interestingly enough, the Ukrainians themselves have realized that doing so would just be an additional burden, because they understand that the Mirage 2000 is a totally different system from the F-16, and you have absolutely no commonality in terms of subcomponents and spare parts and whatever, and logistics and all that. So meaning that we see that providing different weapon systems to Ukraine is only to add burden to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have perfectly understood that the solution that is this kind of patchwork of equipment that has been provided since the beginning of the operation, basically, because the West started to provide weapons since March, April 2022. And all these equipment are not suited, not made for, not even not up to date for the conflict in Ukraine. This was old storage equipment, some obsolete equipment, and so on and so forth. So Ukrainians know that. The problem is, for the Ukrainians, it's probably at this stage more a political problem than an operational problem. I think the Western weapons will not add anything to the capabilities of the Ukrainian army. I think, on the contrary, it will, on the contrary, be an additional burden. But
And what about the second part of that about can Putin outlast the West? Because it seems like it's starting to crack and crumble in terms of the political unity within the alliance.
Well, we see that because more and more you have, and by the way, this was also reflected in the recent European parliamentarian legislative election, that a lot of people in Europe don't follow this, the logic of the current European leadership, because everybody understands that even if, as Blinken said, the Ukraine may have a few success, maybe in the Black Sea, everybody understands that the Black Sea is just a sideshow, is not where the war happens. And where the war happens, where people die, where the political gains are made, where the economic war is waged, this is on the ground, not on the sea. As a result, we see that everybody understands that in Europe. I mean, everybody with common sense, which excludes the leadership, by the way.
Right, right. Unfortunately, yeah.
This is just, and you see that. I mean, that's very much the result of the election, because if you see all the countries where you have a new majority that emerge, some said it was right wing, but in fact, if you look more closely, you will see that these in every European countries where these so-called right-wing parties emerge, in fact, these are people who are skeptical about the way the Europe is managing the crisis. When I say the crisis, I'm not just saying the war in Ukraine, but the whole thing, meaning including the sanctions, including the economic impact of the sanctions on the social life in Europe and everything. So people understand, because at the end of the day, the guy on the ground, when he's losing his job because his company or his factory cannot manufacture things because energy is too expensive, he understands perfectly that the root cause of that are the sanctions. Yep. And that's, I think, it surprisingly enough, our political leadership has not understood that, but the grassroots population have perfectly understood that since months now. And you have more and more people who are questioning the purpose of entertaining this war, so to say, because there is absolutely no point. And you have more and more voices on both right and left wing, by the way. So it's not, it's a very bipartisan thing in Europe, most people say, well, let's stop that because it doesn't. In addition to that, that's something you don't have in the US. There are all the refugees because you have all these Ukrainian refugees who are in our countries, and
Millions of them.
everybody. There are millions of them, and we understand perfectly that these guys will not go back to Ukraine because what's the point? These guys have been here for 2 years in Europe. They have found a job. Some have married with Europeans, so they have no incentive whatsoever to go back to Ukraine. So they will stay here, and they are taking the job of other people. So and by the way, why would they go back to a country which is half destroyed?
Right. Yeah, it's going to be decades before that gets rebuilt. And speaking of delusional thinking, unfortunately, I'm going to give you two examples here. It's not supposed to be. One of them you might give some understanding to. The second one shouldn't get any leeway, but it's there anyway. First, this is what Zelensky is saying about where this war is going to go. Now, if you want to say that you're not going to win on the battlefield, then that would imply that you need to be worrying about trying to negotiate a table to try to win something there. But listen to this from Zelensky, and you see a problem develop.
A lot of countries say that we need it, we need ceasefire, we need to sit and have frozen document, and war will end. No, the answer is not only about territories; it's about our security. He will never stop. Yes, until he will lose in this war, but he will lose, not the world. His losing is just to be on his territory. We don't need any piece of his, any meter of the sovereign other country. That means that we don't want, just my signal is, don't want to repeat Minsk agreement.
So he doesn't want to repeat the Minsk agreement. He doesn't want a negotiated settlement, and he does want all of his territory. Now, that was back in February. So you would think, all right, so probably somebody told him, cool the jets on that. But here's 1 week ago, John Kirby said this.
We have to stand up to aggressors. You can't let them just change borders by force. And we have done that. And it's not just the United States. 50 some other nations have helped Ukraine try to beat back this aggression. And you're right about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. That is Ukrainian soil. And they have every right to claim that soil back. It's their country. And we want to make sure they have the tools to do that and the skills to do that. And we're going to continue to provide that kind of support.
So then President Biden agrees with the 1991 Ukraine territory.
Of course.
Of course. The 1991 borders. Colonel, there is no fantasy world where the 1991 borders are ever recovered by Ukraine, period. Even if they got a bunch of, volunteers, like hundreds of thousands of, trained fighters, et cetera, then you're going to escalate into nuclear war anyway, because Putin's been very clear about that. So there is no world in which 1991 is achieved yet. You see that's what America is still claiming is the President Biden's objectives.
Well, that's the problem of the Westerners. Basically, there was an objective in at the beginning of this conflict. The idea was to not just weaken Russia, but to make the Russian political system, economic system, Russia as a system to collapse. That was the idea. And that was, as I already mentioned several times, that was written and explained into this RAND Corporation document extending Russia from March or April 2019. And the US has followed very closely this scenario. So this is exactly what they want. The problem is that the whole strategy was based on a wrong assessment of Russian capabilities and capacities. I mean, first of all, we underestimated the resilience of the Russian economy. And second, we underestimated the, let's say, the connection between the Russian population and its leadership. And we have seen that since the beginning of this conflict, we have the Vladimir Putin personally, basically, I may have statistics here that shows the popularity. Here I have it, the popularity of Vladimir Putin. And so you have the approval of Vladimir Putin since 2021. And you can see that there is, since the start of the special military operation, the approval rate of Vladimir Putin is more than 80%. And you had just, it weakened a little bit when you had the withdrawal from Kharkov in October 2022. But for the rest, and these are the very last in measurements in May this year, it's 87%. So the thing is that the West underestimated the approval rate of Putin, and they expected that the slightest the slightest sanction over Russia would make the whole political system to collapse. And this is definitely not what happened. And as a result, today, they are short of a strategy. They are short of objectives. They don't have any. And that's the reason why they come back to this question of coming back to the borders of 1991 or 2014. But militarily speaking, and you know that better than me, there's absolutely no way the Ukrainian can regain the territory. By the way, that was the purpose of this counteroffensive that was first announced in July 2022. That was postponed to fall 2022, then winter 2022, 2023, and then to spring 2023, and finally it happened in summer 2023. And remember that even the Pentagon was extremely skeptical about the ability of the Ukrainians to have any success in this counteroffensive. And as a result, in fact, it didn't have any success. So we are just in the wishful thinking here since the beginning. And the problem here is that today we have absolutely no objective. And on the other hand, if you look at Zelensky has other problems, because more and more you have in the population, and here you have a poll that was conducted in June this year by the Kiev International Institute for Sociology, that shows that people are more and more critical about Zelensky. And you have only, according to this poll, you have only 18% of the Ukrainians who believe that Zelensky fulfilled its promises, that the promises that he made before being elected. As a result, you see that there is, although the poll, of course, it's made under specific conditions, and we understand that probably those guys, the guys who made the poll, have to be very prudent. But at the same time, what you can read between the lines, is that the approval of Zelensky is plummeting, and Zelensky is in fact supported just by the extreme right-wing part of the country, which is, by the way, the western part of the country. I mean, those traditional hardline Ukrainian, hardline nationalists, those who, in fact, in May 2019, promised to Zelensky they would kill him if he would fulfill its promise, the promise he made before being elected. So, and now we have this being applied. In fact, Zelensky, I think, is a very uncomfortable situation, that he knows that he cannot achieve any success, but at the same time, he is condemned trying to fight, because the guys who support him will not allow him to have to start negotiating with Russia. So,
and now here's one of the problems with that. I think that many in the West might say, well, then let's just keep this going on. I think that's why you're seeing today the U.S. is even talking about a 10-year program. While Zelensky was saying he was working on a 10-year program. However, I don't know that we're going to get to 10 years for two big reasons. Number one is this is starting to have a pushback, and I want you to talk about how legitimate you're concerned about this. But Putin is now saying, hey, especially since about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the U.S. now officially authorized Ukraine to use our weapons on Russian soil, he's saying, you know what? Turnaround is fair play. Here's how he put it.
Мы думаем на тему о том, что если кто-то считает возможным поставлять такое оружие в зону боевых действий для нанесения ударов по нашей территории и создания проблем для нас, то почему у нас нет права поставлять наше оружие такого же класса в те регионы мира, где будут наноситься удары по чувствительным объектам тех стран, которые делают это в отношении России?
Now that was about a week ago. The addition to that, so that's on the potential tit for tat kind of thing, which Russia's quite good at. But I want to read you something that was sent today on Dmitry Medvedev's Telegram channel. Now, a lot of people dismiss what he says because they say, oh, he's a clown. But he is close to Putin, and I don't think you can ignore it. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, there was yet another round of sanctions that were imposed on Russia. We've been doing that forever, and as you just mentioned a second ago, it hasn't had any success. But let's look at what Medvedev said today. He's saying, on the one hand, maybe we should do nothing because we've learned how to live with these things for a long time. But on the other hand, he said, and I'm quoting now, after all, the USA and their allies have declared war on us without rules, so we should respond. But how to react? I already talked about this once, but it's worth repeating. Every day we must try to inflict maximum harm on those countries that have imposed these restrictions on our country and our citizens. Harm in everything in which harm can be done. Harm to their economies. Harm to their institutions, their rulers, harm to the well-being of their citizens, their confidence in the future. To do this, we must continue to look for the critical vulnerabilities in their economies and hit them in all areas, cause damage in all places, paralyzing their work of their companies and government agencies, find problems in their most important technologies, and strike them mercilessly. So that sounds like an expansion of what Putin himself said a second ago, which is why I'm saying I don't think we can ignore these. Here's my question for you. How serious is Russia about doing this, and are they worried about that escalating if they make good on those things?
Well, I think, as you rightly said, we shouldn't dismiss what Medvedev says. I think it's a kind of a bad cop, good cop game between Vladimir Putin and Medvedev, meaning that by saying what he said, Medvedev sets the upper limit of what they can do at this stage, or what they have in mind at this stage, meaning that the response can be anywhere between what Vladimir Putin says and what Medvedev says. And I think that's kind of a warning signal we should probably be aware of. Now, we have also, you mentioned the use of weapons on Russian territory, but notice that the Biden administration, although they green-lighted the use of weapons over Russian territory, they also made some limitations about the use of ATACMS on the Russian territory, because they don't want, in fact, those weapons to be used in the depth of Russian territory, knowing that the depth of the deep Russian territory is in fact the red line of Russia. And there is what I feel, maybe you have a different understanding being American, but what I feel from my European eyes, if you want, is that the US doesn't want to abandon Ukraine. They will continue to support Ukraine and to have a kind of a rhetoric that supports Ukraine. But at the same time, they don't want the conflict to escalate. They don't want to spend more resources on this conflict. I feel that for a lot of Americans, and that was reflected, by the way, in the discussion you had in the Congress for the those $61 billion for Ukraine, a lot of people understand that the thing is lost. And remember that even the Biden administration tried to press Zelensky to have some kind of negotiation already in November 2022, meaning that since November 2022, there is a sense in the Biden administration that the thing is lost for the West. Now, what they are doing is a kind of a rearguard combat. This is just a saving face exercise, but there is no hope that, despite the rhetoric, I think nobody imagined seriously that Ukraine will regain the territory, and even the idea of victory. I think we have even mentioned that on this channel, that even Lloyd Austin was not able in front of the committee, the Senate committee on the armed forces, was not able to articulate what victory could be. So, meaning that we know that this is lost. The problem is that we don't want to stop everything because we can't do that. And as a result, we'll do that on a very low key. We keep this conflict low key, and it will continue that way.
Yeah, and in fact, you said that's what it looked from European eyes, and what was it from American eyes? From my perspective here, it's actually just two sides of the same coin, so to speak, because we had Kirby a couple of days ago actually say, yeah, we've given some permission, but it is limited. Here's how he put it.
Right now, there's no change in our policy about the use of ATACMS, a long-range strike missile of 300 kilometers or so, for use inside Russia. And again, I want to remind, the guidance we've given the Ukrainians is to go after things that are an imminent threat just over that border. Again, will we have to talk to them about what that looks like going forward? Probably so, but that's the guidance they've been given right now.
But here's the problem. We for sure do want to avoid, without question, the Biden administration does not want to have a direct fight with Russia. There's no doubt about that. But we want to try to have our cake and eat it too, because here's what Biden said about what he does want to do.
You haven't bowed down. You haven't yielded at all. You continue to fight in a way that is just remarkable. Just remarkable. And we're not going to walk away from you. I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding, because we had trouble getting the bill that we had to pass, that had the money in it, from some of our very conservative members who were holding it up. But we got it done finally, and since then, including today, I've announced 6 packages of significant funding. Today I'm also signing an additional package for $225 million to help you reconstruct the electric grid. But once we got the national security bill passed, that was a political issue. We were able to get it all done. And the way you stood and holding on in Kharkiv, and you're proving once again the people of Ukraine cannot and will never be overtaken. And I assure you, the United States is going to stand with you. You've said that all during this debate. I continue to say it. The United States is standing with you. You are the bulwark against the aggression that's taking place. We have an obligation to be there. And so I'm looking forward to having a detailed discussion with you about where we go from here. But we're still in completely, thoroughly. Thank you.
See, the oriented that we're still in completely, thoroughly. So we want to keep this going for a long time. We want to sign a long-term agreement later this afternoon for 10 years, perhaps. So we don't want direct war, but we do want it to keep going. Perhaps unstated, the actual strategy is to just keep bleeding Russia without it costing us anything. I mean, that's kind of what it's starting to look like.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I totally agree with you. The thing is that as a result, it's not Russia that's bleeding, it's Ukraine. And
that is an incredibly important point.
Yeah. That's the problem, and in fact, what it will lead to is that there is an incentive for Russia to make Ukraine to disappear. If I put it that way, if I put it bluntly, if I were Putin, I would say, well, the consequence is that as long as you have Ukraine, I'll have a problem. So I have to make Ukraine somehow to disappear, either by destroying its economy, but by destroying its all capabilities, destroying its military capabilities. That's what they are doing, by the way. We see that recently I saw an advert of the Ukrainian Red Cross, and they were asking for funds because they have 3 million disabled. 3 million disabled. Now, if you consider, I mean, we have no idea how much fatalities they have in Ukraine, but if you take the usual ratio of 3 to 1, meaning that they might have something that's close to 1 million disabled fatalities. So it's probably less than this, by the way. I think it's probably closer to 500,000, but we don't have the figures.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is that all these disabled people, all these people who have left the countries, and we have more and more reports showing that you have more and more individuals, including security forces, SBU personnel, and military personnel, who are leaving the country clandestinely, meaning that people have understood in Ukraine that the situation is hopeless, and basically, regardless of how this will happen, you may, as a matter of fact, you may see Ukraine to disappear. I mean, factually, even if Russia doesn't take the whole territory, this territory may just be empty at one point, because you have no combatant anymore. You don't have economy anymore. I have heard that the power capacity, power production capacity, electricity production, will be almost impossible to sustain the existing society by next winter, meaning that the whole country will not be viable. So as a result, this is the consequence of exactly what Kirby or even Biden said, that if the US and its Western allies, by the way, because it's not only the US, and some Western allies, European allies, are probably even more royalist than the king, by the way. We have also to remember that people like Macron or the Polish government and so on, they might be even more extreme than the Biden administration. In any case, what might happen is that by sustaining this war, Russia will have an incentive to make everything possible to make this any activity, military, economic, political activity, impossible. And that's exactly what we are doing.
We had a show on yesterday with John Mearsheimer. We had him on, and we were talking about at that time the political implications that are going on both in Europe and the United States, and the fact that former President Trump is leading in many of the polls and could well win in November, and he's already on record saying that he's going to seek a negotiated settlement. He doesn't want the war to continue on. And Mearsheimer made an interesting observation about. Can the Biden administration just drag this out to the election day to try to get it passed and then deal with things afterwards? Watch what he said.
But in a very important way, one could argue that before politics has a chance to play itself out, events on the battlefield will determine the outcome of where this is all headed. The fact that the Ukrainians are in so much trouble and that the Russians are on the march tells me that this one cannot last that much longer. And by the time the politics plays itself out, I would imagine that things will be pretty much settled on the battlefield.
And how do you view that? So he's talking like potentially within 5 months, there maybe the Ukrainian army could finally just break and collapse. How do you see that?
Well, I don't really know. We remember that last year, in the end of last year, we had also the impression that everything was collapsing, and there was some suggestion that probably also because the Biden administration would anticipate the election year or the presidential election year, and so they would try to find a settlement. And so we predicted so many times that this conflict would end before the presidential election that I have the feeling that it's probably an optimistic view. It's possible. I don't have the crystal ball, and probably John Mersheimer is right. I have no idea, but I have the feeling that what's at stake at this stage is that nobody wants to lose face, and that's the problem. We have almost an ego problem, and again, you have the US perspective and you have the European perspective. And nota bene that we are talking about this bilateral agreement. US will sign this agreement, but you have already about 15 countries in Europe that have already signed the agreement. Meaning that, again, that I repeat what I said, in Europe you have people who are more royalist than the king. And they may be even more bellicist or wanting to have a conflict than the US. And that's probably the unknown factor that may affect the outcome of the conflict. So the presidential election is certainly an important milestone that will define how this conflict might happen. But don't underestimate the reaction of people like Macron and so on. Now, what I cannot assess at this stage is the impact of the elections we had just last weekend, because they might have an impact on the leadership. For instance, in Belgium, you had the European election, and at the same time, you had the parliamentarian elections of the country itself. And as a result, the center-left government that was in place collapsed, and now you have a right-wing government that will come to in power. So, and you have such situation in different countries, in Austria as well, meaning that you may have some changes within the European Union. Remember that you have already Slovakia and Hungary, who are very skeptical about the way the European Union is conducting this conflict or this crisis. And you may have, even from Italy, for instance, Italy has changed several times. It's from Mrs. Meloni has changed very many times her way of addressing this crisis. But now people feel that the cause is lost in Ukraine, and the more you continue, the more it will harm Ukraine. But again, you have this struggle within Europe, which is at this stage, from my point of view, very difficult to predict what consequence it will have on the battlefield.
And you know what's so agonizing to me is that, I mean, I've been saying for the last couple of months that I'm not sure that the Ukraine army will make it through the summer without having a collapse, but they do certainly have continued on for a long time, and they are clearly long suffering. But here's the problem. There is, as you've said many times, there is no path to eventual success. You can't wait Russia out. Yeah. You can't just hope that it changes later, because the fundamentals don't exist. Yeah. So the longer it takes for them to collapse, ironically, just means more of them will die pointlessly.
Absolutely. There is no military solution to that. I mean, the only military outcome is a victory of Russia. That's what I can say. However we define victory, that could be a question. But a victory of Ukraine from a military point of view is, in my opinion, excluded at this stage. And there is no way we will find we can, of course, define if Ukraine takes again Avdiivka or a place like this, they can define this as a victory and a big victory against Russia, maybe. But the fact of the matter is that they will not be able to regain the territory that was taken by Russia. They will not be able to regain the sovereignty over the two republics of Donbass and the oblast of the south of the country. I mean, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk. So that's, in my view, this will remain under Russia rule, and the same applies to Crimea. And even if the Ukrainian army would achieve to make a breakthrough and reach Crimea, I think the population will not accept the return of because we have
that doesn't even talk about the possibility that Putin would then use nuclear weapons to prevent that happening. So it's a lose-lose every way you want to look at it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there is no point. And remember that you have the most of the population, and probably the large majority of the population, which is in the Russian zone, are strongly pro-Russian. Yeah. And even in the Ukrainian zone, by the way, because there's something nobody talks about. If it is that you have pro-Russian resistance within Ukraine. I mean, in the western part of Ukraine, you have partisans, Russian partisans, that derail trains, that make sabotage action against, and you know, when you have those strikes, missile strikes against weapons depot,
yeah,
the intelligence comes from these resistance organizations that are clandestine organizations that are in the western part of Ukraine. And this is something nobody wants to address in the West, because that would contradict the narrative that everybody is against Russia and all that. This is absolutely not true. And we have video, and I have some videos of guys from this resistance. Of course, they are masked and all that, a little bit as you may have in a resistance organization like the Hamas or so. So they have masks on the face and all that. But when they made a video and they explained what they have done, I mean, definitely there is a very strong resistance organization within the western part of Ukraine. I mean, in what is left from Ukraine today. So meaning that I don't see any opportunity for Ukrainians to regain the territory or to gain any a strategic or operational advantage over the Russians.
Yeah. I mean, it simply doesn't exist, and it breaks my heart to see the Ukrainian people paying for all of these elites, both in Washington and in Kiev, as well as European states. But that's just where it is, and we just have to realize that and recognize that. We're going to continue to track this, especially as we get the details of this deal that comes out later today. And also, and we might mention this again, because we're going to have you back on Saturday when the Switzerland Peace Conference is, so people can look forward to that. But we thank you for coming on today and talking to us about this and giving us the bottom line of the things that are important, both militarily and from a European perspective. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we thank you guys for watching us too. And like we said, this is a triple header day. We have the third iteration coming up this afternoon with Larry Johnson, former CIA officer, who's always got some great insights and a lot of sources that you just don't get anywhere else. So Larry's going to be on later this afternoon. Watch the channel for that. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.